Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, Tomcat Stitchery. I'm Whitney and today we have part 2 of our Kimberly Sew Along. So for today we are going to be tackling the V-neck bodice. We're going to be making the entire bodice for the V-neck. And in this version I am doing obviously the V-neck and I'm doing it sleeveless. I have omitted the facings and instead fully lined it with a lining. I'm going to talk about lining here in just a second, but next week we will be doing the scoop neck bodice, which will have sleeves. We will also be fully lining that bodice instead of using the facings, and I will also be showing you how to draft a scoop neck bodice next week. That footage got lost from last week's video, but I decided it just made sense to wait until we were actually sewing that bodice before I actually showed that footage. So that will be coming next week for the scoop neck bodice. And then the week after that, we'll be putting this, the skirts are the same, other than I'm hemming one regularly with like a narrow hem, and then the other one I'm actually going to use the hem band. I have not used the self fabric tie belt for either dress, but you definitely could. And I have changed up the pocket piece just a little bit, but I show you how to do that as well in today's video. Can't remember if it's in today's video. I filmed a lot. Before we get to actually sewing the skirt, I will show you how, I think it's today's video, how I just changed up the drafting a little bit on that pocket piece. But anyway, lining. So for both bodices, like I said, I am omitting the facings and just fully lining just the bodice of both dresses. A lot of people have asked what I like to use for lining fabric, and that really kind of depends. Basically, lightweight fabric is what you want to use for a lining. Just something that doesn't add a lot of bulk to the fashion fabric. Now, that being said, my sleeveless version that I'm making with the V-neck, I want that to be able to wear because it's in a kind of a, I think it's called autumn gold color, which could easily go into the fall. So I want to be able to wear that over shirts pretty easily. Also, I'll layer things on top of it probably as the weather cools down. But I do want it to easily go over other tops. So because of that, I chose a little bit slippier of a lining and went with a crepe de chine, a silk crepe de chine that I had in my stash from my mentor Joyce. And I chose a color that was close to my skin tone because I didn't have anything that was close to the color of the dress. So that's always a good trick too. You don't have to necessarily use something close to the bodice, the fabric, your fashion fabric color. You can use something your skin color, and then it just won't necessarily peek out in spots. So if you're ever someplace and you find silk or Bimberg rayon or cotton lawn or cotton batiste for a really good price, buy a whole bunch in your skin tone color. You can use that for all sorts of bodices. So that is what I'm using for that one. Now for the second dress that I'm making, the scoop neck dress, I'm actually going to be lining, that is a linen rayon blend, and I'm actually going to be lining it in a really lightweight linen that I recently used, so I had just enough for the bodice. But the reason for this is a lot of times it just makes sense to line something in a similar fabric. So for instance, if you're making a cotton dress, line it with a light cotton lawn or a cotton batiste. If you're making, if you're making a wool dress, you would not line it with wool. Actually, silk is my favorite for wool. But if you want something a little more budget conscious, I would look for a Bimberg rayon because natural fibers are breathable. Any natural fiber, your linen, your cotton, your wool, your silk. You want to use a lining that is also breathable, especially one that is a bodice of a dress where it is tight fitting. I never line my dress bodices with polyester or acetate or nylon. Now, a jacket is a different story because, you want that to be nice and slick and get your arms in and stuff, and it's not on your actual body all day long, like it's another layer. So that's fine. I will use polyester, acetate, that kind of thing for those linings on occasion. But for bodices of anything that's touching my body, I like to use natural fibers. It's just more breathable and it just kind of melds with the fabric, your fashion fabric a little better. Now, I guess if you were making a polyester dress, you could definitely line it in polyester, that kind of makes sense. I don't sew with polyester a lot, so that's just kind of, where I stand on that. But basically, lightweight fabrics, slippy fabrics like charmeuse, silk charmeuse. Bimberg rayon is a very nice silky fabric. It's a rayon, but it is nice and slippery. It can be a little bit of a bear to sew with, but you know, for a bodice, it works really well for bodice linings. China silk is fantastic. It's a really lightweight silk, and a lot of times it's pretty reasonably priced. And then obviously, crepe de chine isn't as slick as like a charmeuse, but it does do the trick if you've got any in your stash as well. So I hope that answers that question on that. And obviously, feel free to ask me any other questions down below, and I will answer those as they come in. All right, so today we are again tackling the Kimberly bodice. Now, I actually ended up doing a petite adjustment on this bodice that I'm not showing in this video. However, I have a video going up on Wednesday that will have that will show you how I'm doing a petite adjustment. I wanted that to be pulled out and be separate because I've had a lot of questions about that. And if you're watching this much later, that video for the petite adjustments will be under tutorials on the playlist page. So that will be very easy to reference at that point. All right, also wanted to note, if you are enjoying these sew-alongs and if you're learning a lot and want to help support the channel, I do have a Ko-fi account, and I have a link for it down at the bottom of the description box, which is basically like a tip jar. So if you do want to help support the channel monetarily, I think that you're buying me a coffee, basically, is why it's called. It's KO/FI, but it's, you know, buying me a coffee, kind of like a tip jar, but anything that I do get from that account, I am putting right back into the channel in terms of raw materials, filming equipment, editing stuff, lights, that kind of thing, but all things to help hopefully make the channel the best it can be. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Again, leave any questions you have down below, and I'll be sure and answer them, and I will see you guys next week. Bye. Okay, so we are going to be sewing up the V-neck bodice, which I am going to be using the V-neck bodice without a sleeve, and I'm not going to be sewing the hemband onto this one. I'm going to do that on the scoop neck version, but I did want to show you, I forgot to do this last week. This is the hemband of the skirt. So if you are planning on doing the hemband even for your V-neck bodice, well, either version, and if you have made a full bust adjustment and you've added that width in the bust or in the waist and then also in the width of the skirt, I forgot to tell you that you need to add that width to the hemband. Got a few people pointed that out, and that is absolutely right. So the pattern has you cutting out 2 of these on the fold. You can't hardly see that, but it does say skirt panel, cut 2 on the fold. So since our front is now an inch and well, it's actually 2.5 inches wider, but 1.25 inches each side, I needed to add 1.25 inches to the end, to the fold, basically. So I'll cut 2, but I'll cut 1 at this fold line for the back and 1 at this fold line for the front. So that is adding the necessary width for the hem part of the skirt on the hemband. So I did want to point that out. Another thing that I have done that I wanted to talk to you about is the pocket. So here we have our skirt front piece, and this is where I've added, you know, my 1.25 inches to match my waist seam. This is the pattern piece here, and it is meant to be sewn in between these notches here on the side. However, I do not like pockets like this. I find that they flap around really easily. I like when my pocket gets sewn into the waist seam here. So what I've done is I just redrafted a pocket piece. It is exactly this pocket piece, and I even marked my notch here to match up to the notch of the skirt. And all I did was I put this onto the skirt, the actual pocket piece that comes with the pattern. And then I measured over, I don't know, like 3.5 inches or so, and I even marked it here on the pattern. And then I just freehanded and drew down and then took it into the scoop so it's the same pocket size. So I've just added this little section basically on here so that the whole pocket gets sewn to the front of the skirt, which keeps it from flapping around. And I just find that it sits better. So I have redrafted a different, that's just my preference. So you can, you know, do it either, but this is the pocket that I will be using, not the one that comes with the pattern. Again, just personal preference. Okay, so those are the 2 changes. So aside from that, for this version, I am got one front bodice cut on the fold. I have done a petite adjustment on this, and I have that video coming up on Wednesday. A petite, obviously, it's been done on both the V-neck and the scoop neck. Also, next week, when I'm sewing the scoop neck version bodice with the sleeve, I will be showing you how to draft that scoop neck version. I apologize that that footage got annihilated last week, but I'll just wait and put that footage up. I've already filmed it, but I'll wait and put that footage up next Sunday when we sew the scoop neck bodice. So there's one bodice in the fashion fabric, and then I have also cut one front bodice on the fold. Is that the front? Yeah. And this silk lining. I chose this color because it's very, as you can see, very close to my skin color, so I thought it would mesh nicely. And then I've cut 2 backs in fabric, plus 2 backs in the silk, which is my lining fabric that I'm choosing. You don't have to use silk. I should have gone over lining earlier in the video, so you can choose what you'd like, but I am using crepe de chine for my bodice. And then you need 1 skirt front cut on the fold, and then 2 skirt backs cut on the fold, which is right here, and then 4 pocket pieces. And then if you are doing the hemband, you need 2 hembands cut on the fold. I'm just not doing the hemband on this version. I am doing a hemband on the second version that I'm making. So just to give you a little bit of variety. So this is what you need for the V-neck bodice or the V-neck dress. Obviously we're just working on the bodice today, but these are all the pieces you need for the V-neck, sleeveless V-neck dress. Okay, so for the V-neck bodice, step 1, you need to sew your darts. So we have 2 waist darts, and you can probably see I've marked them with my friction pen that disappears when I hit it with steam. So we're going to sew our bodices, a dart on each back bodice piece. And then on our front bodice, we have 2 waist darts and 2 side darts. So 4 darts on the front, 1 dart each on each back piece. And then we're going to do the same for the lining pieces. And then we are going to connect our fronts and our backs at the shoulder seams, right sides together, and only at the shoulder seams, both for the right sides together. We'll be doing that both for the self fabric and do the same thing for the lining. So we will have all the darts sewn on the front or on the fashion fabric, and also all the darts sewn on the lining, and then have the fronts and the backs connected at the shoulder seams on both the front and the lining. And then we are going to stop there, because then we are going to connect the lining to the fashion fabric. So let's go over to the sewing machine and do those steps now. Okay, so we're sewing our darts first. I wanted to show you how I sew my darts. I'm just going to show you on one, and then we're going to go, because it's really hard to do this with the camera in my lap. Okay, so let me orientate myself. Well, let's move over here. Okay, so I've got my dart legs right here. And these are the proper dart legs. I have a little whoopsie where I was using the wrong ones. So these are my dart legs. This is the wrong side of my fabric. So I'm going to match my dart legs up like this. This is one of the waist darts, but this obviously works for. So I'm going to pin those together. Now I'm going to come up here, and you can see there is the point of my dart right there. Flip that over. The point of my dart right there. So I'm going to pop a pin so that the point of that dart is right on that fold. And those are the only pins I use. Okay, now we're going to come back over here. So I start obviously at the base of the dart. I'm going to move this pin and put this in this way. Starting at those dart legs, obviously. I'm going to, hold on, I've got my machine set on a basting stitch. That's not going to be helpful. Okay, so we are going to anchor that down, then I'll remove my pin. Okay, So now I eyeball this. You can definitely draw on your dart legs if you want. I just eyeball it, so that's up to you. But I'm going to show you how I do the tips of my darts, which is the important part. So I'm going to sew this. Sorry, I just put new thread in my machine. It's getting all tangled up. Sew this, and then when I get right up to that dart point, I'm going to get right next to the fold. Hopefully you guys can see how close I am. Hopefully you can see that, how close I am to the edge of that. So I'm literally like, there's the fold. It's right next to the edge of the fold. And then I raise my presser foot. So maybe you can even see that a little better. And I rotate, see how close I am to the edge? I rotate it all the way around. And then I'm gonna sew back about, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch, full inch, back along the fold into the dart bulk. And then once I've gone a little bit, I backstitch. So that, oh, come on. I'm too close. There we go. So as you can see, I sewed all the way down to the point, and then I sewed back along the crease, and then backstitched into the bulk of the dart. That I find gives you the best ends of your darts. So now I'm just going to sew all the rest. I'm going to put you on the end of the sewing table and sew all the rest of the darts that I need to sew. Yeah, and then we'll go on to the next step. Before I go any further, I also wanted to say you need to stay stitch your neckline and your armhole because we are sewing this sleeveless. We don't want to stretch any of that out. So I'm probably not going to stay stitch my lining just because that's going to get sewn in pretty quickly. But I am stay stitching my fashion fabric. So I start at the shoulder seam and sew to the center on the back at the 5/8 inch seam allowance because I'm going to sew right over that line when I'm sewing my lining in. And then on the armhole, start at your shoulder seam and sew down to the side seam. So do that, and then on your front, obviously you'll be starting at the shoulder seam, sewing down to the V, stopping, and then sewing from the other shoulder seam down to the V and backstitching, and then you'll do your armholes the same. But make sure you stay stitch those areas so that they don't warp and get pulled out of whack. All right, so now this is what we should have. We should have a bodice, let me put it right side up, that is connected at the shoulder seams. That is not right side up. A bodice that is connected at the shoulder seams, and only at the shoulder seams. All of my darts have been sewn, and I've stay stitched. It's probably really hard to see, but I've stay stitched at 5/8 of an inch, which is the seam allowance, around the entire neck edge and around my both arm size.
And then I have a lining where I've done the same, except I've not stay stitched the lining. So now we're going to lay our lining over our fashion fabric, right sides together, and we are going to match the neckline. So we're going to match our shoulder points, and we're going to pin this all the way around. Helps to have pins to do that. So we're going to just pin center front. I'm going to pin, hopefully I'm in frame. I'm going to pin it at my shoulder seams. And again, these are right sides together. Now this method is the same as if you were sewing in a all-in-one neck and armhole facing. It's the same principle, but I mean, I'm going to show it to you. But if you've done that before, this is the same thing. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to stop. We are not going to sew the last, I don't know, 2.5 inches here at the back. We're going to stop sewing, and we'll come back and finish that at the end, actually, because we've got to sew in a zipper. So we're going to leave about this much free. So I'll start sewing, well, actually on the other side, because I'm going to sew with the silk against the feed dogs because it's the lighter weight. So I'll be sewing it this way, but I'm going to start about, 2.5 inches in, and I'm going to sew all the way around the neckline, pivoting at the V, and then stop about 2.5 inches away from the end. So let's go to the sewing machine, and we're going to do that next. Okay, so I'm going to sew the neckline. Again, I'm going to start 2.5-ish inches in. I'm going to sew with the silk against the feed dogs. And basically, I'm just sewing right on that stay stitching line that I stay stitched earlier around the neck, because we don't want that to show on the right side. Okay, so once I've got the entire bodice, it's kind of easier to see because you can see the contrast of the stitch line. Once you've got the lining and the bodice sewn right sides together along the neckline, and again, we're leaving about 2.5 inches free here at either end. This actually gets sewn together once the zipper is in, so it's like one of the last steps that you do in the dress. So that just is going to stay free. So now what we're going to do is we're going to trim down our neckline. So I'm going to start about, not right where I quit sewing, because I mean, we have to get back in there again. So I'm just going to kind of ease my way. I'm actually going to start on the other side. So I'm going to actually kind of ease my way down, and I am essentially cutting the neckline to, I don't know, a little less than half of the original width. You want to be very careful that you're only cutting what you want to cut, that you're not cutting what you don't want to cut. So we're just trimming the seam allowance down by half, a little more than half. And then when we come to the point that's right here in the center, you're going to cut straight down to that point. Don't cut through your stitching, but cut right to your stitching at that point. So basically you'll have 2 passes of trimming down that seam allowance. And then we're going to cut up the other side. So again, I'm leaving it, you know, here's where I've quit stitching right here. So I want to leave that seam allowance pretty fully because I will still need to stitch there and I don't want to get confused. Okay, so we've clipped in the center front, and because this is relatively straight, we don't really need to do any clipping in the front, but in the back, I like to start right at the shoulder seam, and I want to clip into the seam allowance, about every 1/2 inch or so. It'll just be a little bit because then you get close to where you stopped stitching. So I'm going to do that on either side. Okay. So I've just done some clips right there in the curve of that neckline. All right, so now we are going to understitch. And we're going to do it in 2 passes. So we're gonna start, I'm gonna flip this over, so I'm separating the lining from the bodice. Now we're not gonna start here right where we quit stitching because that makes it really hard to flip it back to sew. So you're gonna wanna start your understitching about an inch away from where you stopped sewing. So this is where I stopped sewing, but I'm gonna start understitching here. And when I'm understitching, I'm pushing that seam allowance that I just clipped towards the lining, and I'm gonna stitch on the lining right next to that seam line. And I'm just gonna separate my layers, make sure that my seam allowance is going towards the lining, and I'm gonna sew somewhat close to the point. You're not gonna be able to get right down to the point, but pretty close to the point. And then I will stop, and then I will start sewing again on the other side of the point and go to the other side. So let's do that real quick and I'll show you what that looks like. And again, I'll stop and about an inch away from where I quit sewing. You just don't want to understitch too close to where you stopped because it makes it really hard to turn it. Okay, so now it is, I'm also sliding away from the camera here, my chair is moving. So that's what it looks like to understitch. And again, I've stopped about an inch away from, see that's where I stopped sewing, about an inch away from where I actually stopped sewing them together. So that then when I go back and have to flip it over on itself to continue this line of stitching, it's not, you know, it's, see how it folds up on itself here where it's been understitched. You don't have that issue. Okay. Also, notice we haven't pressed anything yet. That will come. Oops. Okay. Machine's holding my lining hostage. And actually, I mean, you can go ahead now, and if you want to, and press, and you want to press from the lining side and just make sure that you have a little bit of that fashion fabric peeking on the lining side, because that means that the lining is not peeking out onto the right side. So I'm going to go press that really quick, and then we will do the armholes. All right, so now we basically have a finished neckline. Look how pretty, for the most part. Our zipper's not in the back. Okay. So let's lay our bodice back out again. And what we're gonna do is, what we just pressed all nice and neat, we're gonna pull the lining back out. I mean, we're not really pulling it out. Nothing's sewn. I mean, the sides and stuff are still open. We're gonna pull our lining back up towards the top because we wanna lay it right sides together, back over our front, like so. Because now we're going to do the armhole. So now we've pulled that back out, and things are right sides together again. And we're gonna match our, you know, I marked my notches where a sleeve would go in. Obviously we're not doing a sleeve, but I can still match my notches with the lining and the fashion fabric. So I'm gonna pin those at the notches. Now, similar to the back where we started and stopped and left about 2.5 inches, with this, we wanna start and stop at our seam allowance, which is 5/8 of an inch. So you wanna start and stop, and you wanna leave 5/8 of an inch open, okay? Because that's how we're going to sew up the side seam when it's time. So we're just going We're just doing the arm side, just the armhole. So our side seams are still open and they will continue to be open for a little bit longer. All right, so I have this is the arm side. So this is the armhole in the back on one side, and then the armhole in the front on one side. So I'm starting and stopping. I'm gonna have the silk against the feed dogs, the lining layer against the feed dogs. I'm gonna start and stop 5/8 of an inch away from the side seam. So all the way around, and then end 5/8 of an inch away from this side seam. So let me go sew that. I'll show you how to do this on one side, and then I'll just do the other side real quick. Okay, so once we have sewn that, we're gonna do the same thing that we did with the neckline. I'm just gonna go back and I'm gonna leave as much of this seam allowance here at the edges and leave that alone. So I'm just gonna kinda ease my way in and trim this down to around half of its original width. Okay, so I've left, you know, the seam allowance there, and then I eased in and trimmed it down to about half of its width. And now I'm gonna go around, and there'll be a lot more clipping here because you got a lot more curve. And I'm gonna cut to the stitching line, especially in those, that deeper, I have a pretty deep armhole curve in the front because of my full bust adjustment. So I'm really clipping this entire seam line. Okay, now this is where it gets a little tricky. Actually, I'm gonna really quickly do the same thing to the other side before we start flipping things back out. So let me really quickly, once you've done that step, go ahead and do the other side the same way. Okay, so once you've got your both sides done, it looks, you know, kind of like this. So basically, it's kind of a little bit of a mess. So your backs are still open and your side seams are still open right there, but it's a little bit confusing. So now what we have to do is understitch. So this is where this can get a little bit muddled, but remember, sometimes you can't get all the way to the, you have to do this in 2 passes per armhole. And sometimes if the top of your dress is too skinny, you can't get all the way up to that shoulder seam. So you just want to get as close as you can without accidentally getting anything pinched. So I am going to, I haven't flipped anything yet. Everything is still, you know, right sides together. You know, you can see it's all understitched, but there's the seam allowance that's there for the neckline. So everything is still right sides together. I haven't turned anything yet. So I'm gonna put you in front of the machine and show you what it looks like to sew on one side, to sew both the passes to finish off the armhole. So let me reposition you. Okay. So here we have, right here, this is our armhole seam that we have sewn right sides together with the lining and we have clipped. just to give you kind of a point of reference there. Hold on, my pens can go elsewhere. Okay, so we are going to now pull apart. I'm not flipping anything. We just want to be on the right side. And I'm going to pull this apart. And again, remember we left the seam allowance apart. And just like with the back, we don't want to start an understitching right here where we stopped sewing. We want to come in about 1 inch. And honestly, this is under your arm. So, you know, you don't, even if a little bit of the lining pokes out, it's not the end of the world. Okay, so make sure your seam allowance is going towards the lining. And we're just going to sew. And here at the side seam, it's not hard. It's when you get up to the shoulder seam that it starts getting a little convoluted. So you just want to go slow and keep pulling those layers apart as you go. Now see how I'm kind of sewing into a tube. There's my shoulder seam though, right there. So we're easily going to be able to get this. So I'm going to keep, hopefully you can see that. When I get to that shoulder seam, I'm going to back stitch and in that. Okay. So that's the back. All right, so now I'm going to flip that back over. So this is what we just finished understitching this part. So now we want to finish understitch this second part. So we've understitched that section. You see that that's sewn there. Now we want to do this one. So again, we're going to just separate the bodice. And this time the lining is on our right. And we're going to start in about 1 inch. Don't want to get too close. This is the front, so it's a tighter curve, so this is going to be a little trickier. And we're sewing on the lining, and we're making sure that that seam allowance is pushed towards the lining. And go slow, make sure nothing's getting pinched up underneath. You don't want to accidentally sew, you know, like a random part of your bodice to this, which I have done. So hopefully, see, it gets a little harder to see. I'm getting close to the shoulder seam though. There's the shoulder seam right there. So if you get those to match up, it's great, but don't hurt yourself. Okay, so that's been understitched, but still, I mean, it just looks, that's the neck. It just looks, I mean, it's been understitched except for right here at the ends, but now I'm gonna put you back on the end, and I'm gonna do this to the other side, and then I'm gonna show you how to close up the side seam. Okay, so I've done both armholes. So they're both understitched. Luckily, we were able to get all the way up to the shoulder seam on both sides. So that's exciting. Okay, so now what we want to do, because now we have this bodice that's inside out basically. So what you're going to do is you're going to start, it doesn't matter which one of the backs, and go up through one of the shoulder straps. And you're basically, with your fingers, going to grab, it doesn't really matter, the bottom of either the main bodice or the lining. So I've grabbed the main bodice, and you're literally pulling it through. It's like birthing a baby. And you just kind of got to be patient. Sometimes it feels like, did I do this right? Especially if you have really bulky fabric. Although this is like a mid-weight linen. It's not super lightweight. And then once you've pulled that all through, oops, hold on, got to pull the other side through. It didn't all come through. There we go. Once you've pulled everything through, Well, for heaven's sakes. There we go. Okay, once you pulled everything through, you've got a nice understitched finished armhole. So now everything is still, you know, the side seams are not done up. So now you just want to go and press both of your armholes so that you have a little bit of the fashion fabric favoring to the wrong side. So I'm gonna go press that really quickly and get that lying nice and flat, and then I'll come back and show you how to close up the side seams. Okay, so let's go over what we've got so far. So we have our bodice with our darts. Sorry, my linen's very wrinkly. And it's attached to the back, just at the shoulder seams. So we're loosey-goosey open here at the side seams, loosey-goosey open over here. But our armholes are nice and finished, and our neckline is nice and finished, except for the back for our zipper, and also a little bit of our side seams that are right here. All right, so what we're going to do next is just what you would do for side seams normally. So we're gonna flip our backs right side together with our fronts at the side seam on both sides. But this is where it's gonna get different. So obviously we don't wanna sandwich, we gotta sew these separately. So what we're gonna do is just pin the side seam of our bodice together. So I'm gonna place some pins in here. You also notice that we haven't used the serger at all yet because this is all gonna be encased in the lining. So we really only have to use the serger for the skirt portion, and this will be for both tops. So I'm just gonna pull, you know, this is why we didn't sew that seam allowance of those two together. I'm gonna pull that lining out of the way a little bit so that we can match up the fashion fabric really quickly. Main fabric, whatever you wanna call it. All right, so now that that is pinned, now we are going to continue on in a straight-ish line. And we're gonna kind of take and kind of fold that lining kind of in here, because we want this seam allowance to be sewn this way towards the lining. So when we're sewing this, we want this to all lie towards the lining. So let's start pinning actually here at the bottom of the lining. Make it a little easier. Okay, so when we get to this join here, we're actually just going to sew, and you can see where we've stopped sewing right there. It's harder to see on this side because I had a stay stitching line. But we're just gonna basically want to make sure that we are sewing over that. So we don't want a hole at our armpit, but we're just going to sew all of that together and make sure we're sewing those seam allowances towards the lining. So I'm going to start at the bottom of the fashion fabric, and I'm going to sew basically a straight line. Make sure that I cross over where I stopped stitching here at the underarm and stitch all the way to the end here, and make sure that your dart's lying, you know, nice and flat like it's supposed to as you're sewing. So I'm just gonna go do a quick pass on that. Okay, so now we're gonna go, so that's that line that we just sewed. I'm gonna go press this open all the way down, and then I'm gonna flip the lining back over there and give this underarm seam a really good press. I just wanted to make sure it did in fact get all caught, and it did.
So I'm gonna go do that. I'm gonna sew up the other side, and then I'm gonna give it a good press, and then I will come back and show you what that all looks like. All right, so here is our finished V-neck bodice. So we've got our neckline finished here. Our armhole on both sides are finished. I'll flip this inside out so you can see what that looks like too. Obviously this mannequin's much smaller than I am. This is where our back zip will eventually go once the skirt's attached, but we're still open, you know, here at the top on both sides because we got to be able to get that zipper in. That actually sits much better if I actually pull that close. So there is our finished bodice there, and then if I flip it inside out, it's basically the same thing. So you'll see that the fashion fabric's pulling to the inside, which is what we want. It got a little jankety here at the underarm seam with the lining and the fashion fabric. But again, that's under your arm, and I've got it all pulled up nicely and pressed into place, so I'm not worried about that. That can get tricky there at that underarm seam. So our lining and our bodice are obviously still open at the bottom because we will attach this to the skirt, and then this lining will actually get hand stitched to that seam when all is said and done. So we'll attach the skirt here, seam allowance will get pressed up, and then we will hand stitch this seam down to the, oops, locked out the dog, to the bottom of the bodice. So there you go. Our V-neck bodice is finished. So next week, we will do the scoop neck bodice, and then the week after that, we will be attaching the skirts to both and finishing them off. So 2 more weeks of sew along left. Obviously my linen is looking a little worse for wear at the moment, but that's what happens when you work with it. It will press and release these creases really nicely. So there you have it. Okay, we'll see you guys next week for the scoop neck.